Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's having a lovely evening. It's a lovely time of year here in Phoenix. It's actually not 100 million degrees, and it's nice high 70s, low 80s, just gorgeous. Just got done walking our daughter, put her in the tub. She's in bed, so here we go. Tonight, just wanted to talk about a subject that I think was a kind of a breakthrough for me as far as understanding how this stuff with pain and some of these stressors and some of these things that you're hearing in people's story that before I understood some of the concepts we'll talk about tonight, that stuff never made sense. And when people were talking about IBS and POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and all these other body systems that are dysregulated around pain, I never thought anything about it. And then you start reading some of these things about the body systems and how they can be affected and dysregulated, which we're going to talk a lot about tonight. James Stark, saw you here. Good to have you, my friend. I think Keith Meldrum saw you here as well. Great to have you guys. Anybody else who's here, I'd love to know where you're coming in from, what where you're at tonight. Let's get into a little bit of the PowerPoint first. So let me another thing here. Let me see if I can change this webcam so it actually looks like, forget it. We'll take the webcam out. So one book that I think was a turning point in my understanding of a lot of this stuff was Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And I was so bummed in the San Diego Pain Summit when Rajam had Robert Sapolsky come and speak. I mean, he's one of my real preeminent figures really in the world of just pain, well, not necessarily pain biology, but neurobiology and evolutionary biology and all these different things, and really wrote an amazing book that talked about, stressors and how they can be really systemically, bad for us to have chronic stress. And the premise of the book, or the title, is kind of zebras can be at a watering hole and nearly get gobbled by a crocodile, and then 5 minutes later they are all is well. Life is good. They have no problems. Life is and no stressors whatsoever. But humans, what do we carry around? And then you look at some of these things that we talk about here on the screen with all these, things that patients will tell us, oh, the doc told me I got degenerative disc disease and I have all these crumbling discs in my back. I've had 3 patients, I think, this week with horrible conceptions about degenerative disc disease, and then bone on bone with knee. And then, sometimes I have a gentleman recently who works at Home Depot, does not like it, feels it's damaging his knees to be on that concrete all day long. And, then there's stresses of all the financial challenges that people go through with pain, mortgage payments, will they be able to support their family, some of the loss of identity that a lot of folks go through when they're on their journey with pain. So these are things that traditionally I think we take on board as physical therapists or maybe clinicians who are working with folks in persistent pain. But I don't think we really understood how these kind of experiences can really create a bunch of stress for people, and how this stress can really translate to physiology and physiologic changes. And maybe what you're feeling underneath your hands, if you're a manual therapist, might be representative of a homeostatic system that is just crazily protective and in a perpetual state of hyper stress and protection. So let's go a little further into a graph by Lois Giffords. And this comes pretty much directly from his book. I adapted a little bit from the Aches and Pain series. And it looked at how stress can kind of relate to chronic pain. And if you think about patients that have this ongoing pain, and we see the uncertainty, unpredictability, at least they don't have any certainty of what's to expect, and they don't have any predictability of what's going to happen with their pain. Is it going to have a good day, a bad day? Are they going to be able to get through this activity or not? And then, of course, negative emotions and anger are normal, responses of any human being who's going through a difficult, challenging situation like that. And then ongoing unresolved mental stress that all that stuff can take. And these stress systems, which we'll talk about, they can get dysregulated. And then if you look in the middle parts of this, where we talk about maybe some of the things that might stem this stuff on with past trauma, and it could be physical injury and bodily injury that sets a lot of this stuff off. But we often see, and how many of you guys, I'd like to see somebody comment me below, maybe if you treat patients who have no injury whatsoever and maybe their pain was really related to a massive life event, a stressful life event. Maybe they had, I've had patients where their spouses passed away in hospice care, or they had a divorce or a horrible situation going on with their spouse and triggered a massive pain situation. And we'll talk a little bit about allostatic overload and, kind of stress overload when life, and I think we can all relate to this. I know for me personally, when life loads me up to the point I just need to stop, I get headaches, and actually had my first migraine headache last week, which was an interesting experience, where it was severe nausea, could not handle lights, and had to get in a dark room and shut it down for an evening. It was all related to overloading my body with too many things going on, too many commitments, all that stuff. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir to a lot of you guys out there. And then we get environmental and genetic influences on the stress system activity. So how our people, like if you read some of the literature on kids who are growing up in war-torn areas where they are living in stress constantly, where they don't know if they're going to have a bombing in their neighborhood or what, there's this failure to thrive and all these things that really can dysregulate our body's homeostatic systems, where appropriate growth and development, your body doesn't really have good resources to prioritize to that because it's in a perpetual life or death, fight or flight mode. And then these things, as we round it around to the bottom here, as these effects and these systems become dysregulated, immune system hyperactivity and pro-inflammatory changes, loss of control, inflammation, poor health and healing, when your body's chronically sensitive and in this kind of chronic inflammatory situation, hard for tissues to really simmer down after tissue injury. Now, they can structurally kind of mend themselves a bit, but they can still be left with significant sensitivity because they got an immune system that permeates and all these immune chemicals that maintain sensitivity, they maintain connectivity of all these nerves and maintain sensitivity of that person's body and tissues. And then that tissue becomes vulnerable. And then you can see how this cycle can spin round and round with people to where they get stuck on this uncertainty. I think we can intervene a bit. We can, along with maybe some of our psychology colleagues, of connecting the dots of maybe some past traumas they've had in their lives, some of the negative emotions and feelings and beliefs with some CBT-based interventions, some pain neuroscience education to help give folks a little bit more certainty and some predictability and maybe some control and understanding of what's going on in their body, of why maybe things aren't behaving as classically as the physician's office said it should with such imaging findings or so on. So there's a lot of things I think we can take from this graph and apply to our patient load and kind of see where we can intervene as different healthcare professionals to help people. This is another graph from Giffords' book. He's got so many gems in that book. Aches and Pain series. I know a lot of guys here probably are reading it or have read it. If you have read it, I'd love to know. Just comment below, on my shelf. Because I think that is one that should be on your shelf if it isn't, because it's really an amazing 3-book series that really helps you encapsulate the journey of our profession as a physical therapy profession. And not just, you don't need to be a physical therapist to appreciate that, but you can kind of appreciate the journey of science and Lois Giffords' career, and it really parallels awesome with, and he was one of the pioneers with helping us better understand pain, and he was doing this stuff in the late 80s, early 90s, and I think honestly we were just catching up, and man, a huge pioneer beyond his time. But he kind of took Hans Selye's kind of general adaptation syndrome, which is just he was a pioneer of really stress research, and it looked at this alarm, adaptation, and exhaustion. And a lot of times when patients just have kind of brief on and off stressors and they have good coping strategies, and things that are more towards the left here, where they have all this ability to take on physical stress, mental stress, just the loads that life puts us, the biopsychosocial loads that life has to offer us. And then, these stressors can hit us, but man, we have all this, coping capacity underneath this curve that we can handle it. But then, if this time and stressor just keeps continuing on and on, our resources can get kind of tapped out. And if, some of the analogies we use with this is the overflowing cup analogy, or the bank account where you're constantly making withdrawals and you're not really leaving any money in the account to really do any positive financial things with. And then, of course, if stressors become more chronic and more chronic, and you hear the stories of the patients that walk through our clinic doors of all the horrible things that they've gone through and all the identity loss they've had, it makes sense that what reason has their body had to not be in stress, to not chronically be in a state of kind of, protection and threat, because their financial existence is being threatened, their existence as a worker, as a husband, as a wife, as a mother, as a whatever it may be for that patient is completely being threatened constantly. So what reason would it have not to have this stress continue on? And then we get to the point where when we take the strong organism and that stress carries on over and over again to where it becomes a vulnerable organism. And that's the patients I think we can see sometimes like a fibromyalgia patient who's susceptible to upper respiratory infections or is really chronically flaring their body because they can't really do much in the way of activity physically because they just don't have the capacity. Now there's some genetic components, of course. It's not simple that we can just tie it all to past experience and past life experience. Of course, that plays a role, but there's genetic experience or contributions, a lot of different things, that can contribute to a body systems being tapped out, and we'll talk about that here coming forward. And this is the system that we speak about. And if these are the systems that if we understand this whole big graph of the nervous system, immune system, and endocrine, this comes from a Chapman article in 2008 that I've probably shown you guys in this group a bit before, but it just goes into how the autonomics are the electric messengers of these between these systems, and then we have the systemic circulation that communicates between these systems that can bring these systems when, ideally, when it goes in a pro-inflammatory, arousal, and facilitatory state, which it should when we're having acute stressors, maybe an acute tissue injury or anything. We want these systems to activate, to get sensitive, to make your nerves around your tissues get sensitive so you don't go and monkey around and move your tissues that are injured so your body can rest and adapt and heal. And then pro-inflammatory, we want that immune response to come online and come in there and heal and help us mend our tissues and all that stuff. Endocrine system mobilizes a lot of the metabolic stores and different things that help us deal with our injuries, help the stress systems come on board to mobilize behaviors and different things that might help us escape threats and do appropriate homeostatic behaviors that are going to help us engender healing. The problem arises again when these stressors happen chronically and these systems stay in arousal, where these diurnal patterns of nice normal sleep patterns that we all have get completely dysregulated with people. Their body can't tell when to rest and go to bed versus, be ready to be up and at them. So that's where the patients like fibro patients, chronic fatigue patients, and all these things get dysregulated with them. The immune system, another thing, when we look at fibromyalgia patients and we see studies that show that they have chronically high values of cytokine levels, which are can be often pro-inflammatory immune system chemicals or cells. So there's just a lot of things that this graph can really give us a good kind of overarching theme. And this is just part of our homeostatic super system because our motor system probably participates to elicit behaviors, protective behaviors, and different things so we can, tense up our back in the presence of an acute disc herniation so we don't go and bend and pull on our back when it's got an acute flexion injury. Of course, that can become maladaptive, just like some of the immune system and endocrine system, nervous system functions if it becomes a persistent thing over time. So unfortunately, none of these things operate on an island. They often operate in concert with each other. Bruce McEwen is a professor out of Rockefeller University in New York City, and one of the best people I would recommend to just look at his stuff. I'm going to post some of his work and some of his articles under the thread here once I'm done live streaming with you guys. But I think he's one person, if I could say read one person to best understand this thought of allostasis and how our body reacts to stress. He's probably one of the preeminent figures internationally that does it. And allostasis basically is this adaptive and survival-promoting systemic and neural processes that are activated by novel and potentially threatening experiences. One thing I probably would highlight in there are potentially threatening experiences. So if there's a perception of threat, whether it be real or not, whether the jelly is or is not leaking out of your jelly donut, if that's a story your patient has, or whether or not the disc is or is not crumbling with degenerative disc disease, that organism perceives threat, whether it's real or not. If the organism perceives threat, it can activate these stress systems. And when we have major life stressors, abuse, trauma, environmental stressors, physical loads, psychological loads, we could probably list off more different types of stressors that people encounter in life. This can really obviously have an effect centrally at the brain, and you can get development of the individual as this person develops. And again, as we go back to what I just talked about earlier, in these war-torn areas with high levels of chronic stress, and these poor kids who have failure to thrive and all these different things in their early life experience that just keep them in chronic stress, or some of the horrible stories that may have came through your clinic doors of people that have had to go through horrible situations with physical abuse, sexual abuse, and all these terrible things that can really program your genes to become very sensitive. And that's where, if you look to the right of that, of epigenetic changes, that, our life experiences are what really nurtures our genes to express certain genes, turn them on, turn them off, to be sensitive and protective to whatever your life experiences have been. I probably shared this story with you before, but I had a patient who had CRPS. She had it in her foot and her hand, and just very tough case and very challenging case. And we were having a lot of discussions around pain neuroscience education, and she offered up, and I talked to her about, how our life experiences earlier in life can really kind of cause our nervous system to become more sensitive or not. And I shared some stories in my past and different things. And then she shared a story that when she was a young girl, her stepfather attempted to drown her twice in a bathtub. So, oh my God, I mean, again, I've shared this story a bit, but if that's supposedly the most safe place on earth that should be for a person, they're home with their parents, and it's a life-threatening situation for somebody, can you only imagine how tough that is on a human being, and how that's going to really make it tough for their system to describe safety to much in life? And it's probably going to cause some sensitivity that's going to be carried forward for a nervous system that's going to have a hard time declaring safety, when in the most safe place on earth that it should be for a kid was, again, a life and death thing. So this perceived stress and how we perceive some of these stressors, I always tell patients I tend to be on the more stressed side, the high-strung side. I think some of it's genetic, some of it's maybe, our parents and how they kind of react to stressors, we model our behaviors and maybe how we respond going forward in life, how mom and dad might have done it. But these perceived stressors can be different perceptions for different people, but, vigilance over, some of the stressors, helplessness, a feeling of just kind of surrendering. Learned helplessness is a great topic. Jared Hall's done some lectures on that, and some talks that I think are great to just show how learned helplessness can be a very big thing with folks in persistent pain, because their system is almost locked into a prior of no hope. If we look at it from a predictive processing, there's no hope, there's no positive expectation that exists in their being, because they've been through so many failed attempts at overcoming their pain and different things. Nicholas, thanks for joining us. That their body has really developed, neurologically, neurophysiologically, and all these body system-wise, a prior set of just perpetual danger and threat. And then different people have different behavioral responses: fight or flight, avoidance or endurance coping for some of our patients. We also get patients who have different coping strategies that aren't healthy: drinking, smoking, bad diets, all these different things that people can use for coping strategies. But it's important to maybe ask and understand that stuff, especially if you're in a multidisciplinary setting where you might have a pain psychologist or somebody can help patients learn some more of the better coping strategies. And of course we can, as clinicians as well, teach patients to have better coping strategies. And then all these things kind of relate to physiologic responses, and that is basically allostasis, where your body's adapting these processes, behaviors, physiologic responses to bring the system back to homeostasis. Ideally, that adaptation is temporary and things come back to baseline, but if there's a repeated stressor that chronically is going on, or there's a multitude of repeated stressors in a patient's life, that stress response can be dysregulated and cause a boatload of pathophysiology. And this is a great graph that I take from a study by Moss in 2015 that looked like, hey, when life is all good, adequate functioning, here on the left we have normal homeostatic behavior. We have allostasis, where we have some of these mediators of our neuroendocrine system and different things happening, immune system, and all these things activating and putting different chemicals in our bloodstream, but ideally then coming back to normal and going back to homeostatic. It's just when this failed adaptation happens and these chemicals, allostatic load, or these chemicals become a load on the system chronically, we get these primary effects of anxiety, sleep problems, mood changes, depression, all these different things. Then when it gets chronically there, stress overload or allostatic overload, we get abnormal metabolism, cardiovascular risk factors. How many people know somebody who's maybe a high-level executive or a stressed person who might be the most fit CrossFit human, but they are so under such a high degree of stress that they have heart attack at age 40 because they have just a boatload of stress and maybe some other things going on in life as well. But you see some of these things where how can that person who's supposedly the picture of health have cardiovascular issues? And of course there can be genetic and other issues that can contribute to this stuff, but stress chronically is poisonous to the body. It creates cardiovascular issues, neuroinflammation, cardiovascular inflammation, all these different things that can cause some significant issues. And this dysregulation over time, arterial hypertension, cardiovascular disease, stroke, obesity, diabetes, depression. There's interesting research that you can look at that shows that some of this chronic stress can really dysregulate body systems across the human, not just at the neurologic tissue sensitivity level, much more in depth than that. But then look at the medical screening charts of your patients and see all the accompanying diagnoses that come with them of IBS and migraines and TMD and maybe pelvic pain or different things that now I think if you understand this stuff, you should say, well, it's a really dysregulated system you have going on here. And the key is, well, how do we help people grasp that? And one way that I think has been really helpful, I should say, is Matt Lowe's a colleague and a friend out of the UK who's a brilliant physio and does publish a bit in this. And he had this article that talked about a dispositional approach to pain. And basically it lays out what are the things in life that might be restorative in the person's life that might be pushing somebody towards less pain or more towards safety. And then what are the things in the patient's life that might be pushing a patient more towards danger or allostatic overload? And again, he uses this kind of line with these, I can't remember the names of this, but you have lines where you can just take different parts of a patient's story here and put a line, and this cross thing is maybe the resultant of all these things combining together equals an overload, and this line might be that allostatic overload that results in some of this dysregulation, emergence of pain out of a bodily system minus an injury, those type of things. So I think this is a helpful way to look at it, and it's another thing to look at instead of just looking at the biologic loads, the biomechanical loads on a patient, or arthrokinematics and all these things that we tend to be biased towards looking at with a patient. With persistent pain, it's often the biopsychosocial loads, the whole person loads that a patient goes through, that if you can start listening to stories of that patient and start piecing them together, you can start putting graphics like this up of and showing people how this might really push your system to really be overloaded. Can you look at this based on all the things you told me today, and do you think that that's pushing your system to be more in a safe, rest, digest, safety mode, or more danger, threat, fight or flight mode? And most folks can get that, as far as from my experience. Another story I will use with patients, and because again, it's great to know this stuff, but doesn't mean diddly squat if you can't talk to a patient about it and make them make sense of it. So I'll talk to the patients about, let's put you in a dark hallway in an abandoned warehouse in Detroit, Michigan. For those of you folks not in the U.S., Detroit, I'm from Michigan. I've lived in Detroit a few summers, and I think James Stark, I think that's your neck of the woods. Love Detroit. It's a great city. Always love the D, but it is not the best city from a crime perspective, although getting much better, hopefully. But if you put somebody in a scary area like that, and you can put patients in something that makes sense for the population or the culture that you work in, how's your blood pressure going to be, patient? What's your heart rate going to look like? What's your muscle tension? If I drop the pen behind you in this area, how would you react? How would your GI system behave? Sometimes, a little sidebar, I've often will offer this TMI information to patients, but I do think it's helpful, especially with a patient with IBS, as far as, when I have in the history, I've gotten much better with this, but when I used to have big talks at conferences or any big talks in front of big groups of people, my GI system used to get big time dysregulated, because there'd be a stressful, there'd be some anxiety and some talk jitters that I'd go through, and I'm sure other people can relate. You don't have to comment on the board of your GI habits, but I think it resonates with patients when you can kind of share. It's normal for our body systems to go like that. The good news for me, I tell patients, is that my talk gets over and I get a breath of relief. With the life you've been living and all these tough things you've been dealing with, have you had any chance to have a breath of relief or a chance for your system to calm back down? And the other thing I'll talk with patients, well, what if we go to the vice versa? And I've often had patients too who will say, man, I was on vacation. I went to the Catskills. I had a patient recently in the summer, and oh my God, my pain was like I was so much better. I didn't have much pain at all. And vacation is not where your stressors lie. It's not where your mortgage payment worries lie. It's not where some of the financial things. It's an escape. It's a new context. Sometimes our context is just reinforcing of the stressors. It's the thing we wake up with day after day, where we're in the same home apartment that might be where we're not able to get out because of our pain, or we're immobilized, or different things that just reinforce a lot of homeostatic. There's nothing that would push a sense of safety or a sense of ability for that system to get moved towards a homeostatic, allostatic, better position. So in this, on the beach in San Diego, how's your blood pressure? How's your heart rate? How's your muscle tension? I mean, unless somebody's weird and they don't like sunsets on the beach, most folks are going to tie this scenario with a lot more relaxation, heart rate. And then this is where I'll take these two stories and I'll say, so you've told me that you have, and this is where I'll list all these things that are stressors on this person's, in their story. You've told me that you've had to lose your job. You're telling me that your mortgage company is threatening on foreclosing your house. You've told me you and your wife have had a heck of a time with your relationship, as far as you're moody, you guys are fighting a lot, all these different things. You're not able to do any of the things you value that define you anymore. Now, based on all these things that you've told me today, where do you think your body lies? Do you think you're more in the dark alley, or do you think you're more in the beach? And this can be especially helpful for people like with fibromyalgia, or some of these widespread pain syndromes, or different things where it's just, or homeostatic system where there's sleep disruption, sleep dysregulation, all these different things that are systemically dysregulated, where people can start connecting the dots that, yeah, maybe all this crappy experience that this therapist has listened to, has validated, man, it sure does make sense that my body systems are stuck in danger mode. And that's where other resources such as the Protectometer from the Noy group, the Butler and Mosley stuff, of the balance of SIMS and DIMS, different things, however best you can communicate it and understand it for your patients is probably the best way to go with it. So that kind of wraps up what I wanted to talk about tonight, but I hope that was helpful for you guys, because I think it's one thing to understand how these systems and epigenetics and all these different things can get dysregulated, and and all these things can create sensitivity, but how do we put it into words for a patient? That's the skill, that's the art of P&E. And I'm sorry, flashcards can be helpful, but I'm sitting in front of a patient eye to eye and being able to have a conversation with them, listen to their story, validate it, and note these things in their story, note all these things that they're telling you, and be able to reflect those back to them and make them make a decision, and let them decide if their body's in more of a safe zone or a danger zone, or more in the beach or the dark alley. Because I think when patients can understand they're in a dark alley, then you can start saying, well, hey, I'd like to teach you how to move your body towards the beach. And I think there's some great ways we can start moving you there. But your body's been living in the dark alley for a long time, so it's not going to change overnight. But I think if we can start giving your body a reason to feel like it's more towards the beach, I think we can move you in a great direction, and we can start making you move forward. And that story has been very helpful for me with patients. There's a lot of other ones out there too. That's just one of many examples. And we're going to be sharing more stories like this, and more analogies, and more things that will hopefully help you guys as you guys navigate your clinical practice. And if there's anything else in your clinical practice, or anything that you guys are coming up against that you would like to hear from some of us, of how we kind of address it, what ways we found successful, that's what this group is all about. So let's put it out there. Let's help each other out. The more we can share this information with each other, the better chance we're going to be able to help more and more people. And this whole Legion of Change movement grows stronger. with that said, I hope you guys have a great rest of your night. I'm so happy that you guys joined me. For all you guys that were here, thanks for spending your time, and have a great rest of your evening.